The email arrived on a Wednesday, not a Monday, when I might have been sharp and ready for whatever the week intended to throw at me, and not a Friday, when at least the weekend could have softened the blow. A Wednesday afternoon in October, when the New England light was doing that particular golden thing it does before everything turns cold, and I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of Earl Grey, going through vendor invoices for the upcoming holiday season. The subject line read, Proposal Private Celebration Dinner, Harborview, Stonebridge, December 14th. I almost didn't open it. I received dozens of proposals every week, but something made me pause. It had come not to my business address, but to my personal email, the one I rarely used for work. I clicked it open. It was from our events coordinator. 3 pages, beautifully formatted, with our own inn's letterhead at the top. Candlelit table for 2 on the private terrace overlooking the harbor. Champagne on arrival. A customized menu she had titled, in italics, A New Beginning. Special instructions at the bottom. Please ensure Mrs. Callahan's regular Thursday shift is covered, so she will not be present on the property that evening. Mrs. Callahan, that is my name, my married name. She had meant to send this to my husband. She had sent it to me instead. I set down my teacup with great care. Outside, the maple in the backyard had gone completely red. I looked at it for a very long time. Then I opened a new email to my attorney and typed 4 words. I need to see you. I had built Harborview Inn Collection the way most meaningful things get built slowly, stubbornly, and with money that was originally someone else's dream. My grandmother had left me a small property on the Connecticut coast when I was 29, a crooked little house with good bones and a view that made people stop their cars. My mother said sell it. My husband at the time, we had been married only 2 years, said we should think carefully, run the numbers, be practical. I said none of those things. I painted it myself over 3 weekends, found a woman in town who made quilts, called a food writer I knew from my years in catering, and opened Whitmore House Bed and Breakfast in the spring of 1989, with 6 rooms and a breakfast menu that people still ask about to this day. My husband came around once the reservations started filling up. By our 10th year, we had added 2 more properties. By our 20th, we had 7, all along the shoreline, all operating under the Harborview name, a name I had chosen, trademarked, and built into something that had been featured in Yankee Magazine and Travel Plus Leisure, and more than once in the New York Times travel section. We had 22 full-time employees and seasonal staff that swelled to nearly 40. We had a waiting list for rooms at our flagship property from Thanksgiving through New Year's that ran 18 months long. We had built it together, my husband and I. That was always the story I told. He handled the financial side, the contractor relationships, the bank negotiations. I handled everything else, the vision, the brand, the staff culture, the guest experience, the reason anyone came back. I told that story so many times I had stopped examining its accuracy. The truth, if I had been willing to look at it clearly, was that I had built Harborview. He had helped. There is a difference. I noticed things over the years the way you notice, weather changing when you're not paying close attention. Not a single dramatic moment, but a slow accumulation of small signals. My husband began attending industry conferences I wasn't invited to. Meetings with our accountant that happened while I was managing a property emergency 2 counties away. Phone calls taken in the garage. A new gym membership at 58 that he had never mentioned wanting. I filed each observation carefully in the back of my mind, the way you file documents you hope you'll never need to use. We had hired our events coordinator 2.5 years ago, on my husband's recommendation. She had come from a boutique hotel group in Providence, 34 years old, genuinely talented, excellent with vendors and clients. She had reorganized our entire seasonal events calendar in her first 3 months. I had been grateful for her. I had championed her to the rest of our staff. I had trusted her with the keys to our best property. I had trusted both of them. My attorney's office was on the 2nd floor of a converted mill building in town. She was a woman I had known for 15 years, sharp and deliberate in the way that good lawyers are, the kind who listens to everything before she speaks. I laid out what I knew, the email, the subject line, the instruction to keep me away from my own property. She read it twice without expression. Tell me about the ownership structure, she said. I explained it the way I had always understood it, equal partners, both our names on the properties. But as I spoke, something in her expression made me slow down. She asked specific questions. When had certain refinancing agreements been signed? Whether I had reviewed the most recent LLC restructuring. Whether I knew about any new entities registered in connection with the business. I did not know about any new entities. She turned her computer screen toward me. It had taken her approximately 4 minutes to find what she was looking for. A limited liability company registered 8 months ago under a name I did not recognize, Stonebridge Holdings with a single member listed. My husband's name, sole proprietor. I looked at the screen. My tea had gone cold on her desk. I thought about all the papers I had signed over the years because my husband had set them in front of me and said it was a routine refinancing, a standard restructuring, a tax strategy the accountant had recommended. I thought about how I had signed them the way you sign things when you trust someone completely without reading carefully, because reading carefully implies you don't trust the person asking. I had trusted him for 35 years. I had been a fool for 35 years. I understood both of these things to be simultaneously true, and I sat with that understanding without falling apart, because I am 63 years old, and I have survived worse things than clarity. What I need to know, I told my attorney, is what he actually owns and what he only thinks he owns. She smiled slightly. That, she said, is exactly the right question. Let's find out. What we found over the following week was both worse and better than I had feared. Worse because the scope of it was real. 3 of our 7 properties had been quietly refinanced with loans drawn against their equity. The proceeds routed through accounts connected to Stonebridge Holdings. Better because of what my husband had apparently forgotten, or perhaps never fully understood, in all his years of handling the financial side of our business. The Harborview name was mine. I had trademarked it in 1,994 inches, my name alone, before we had restructured anything, before the second and third properties, when it had simply been the name I had given to my grandmother's little house and the life I was building around it. The trademark had been renewed 3 times since then, always in my name. Every licensing agreement our properties operated under the historic preservation designations, the state tourism certifications, the brand partnership agreements had been signed by me as the trademark holder. You could own the buildings, my attorney explained, with what I recognized as quiet satisfaction, but without the Harborview name and the licenses attached to it, you cannot operate them as the properties they currently are. The value is in the brand. The brand belongs to her. The her was me. I spent the next several days doing what needed to be done methodically and without drama. I opened a new business account in my maiden name. I had a quiet conversation with our head of operations, a woman who had been with me for 11 years, and told her only that there were some ownership matters being reviewed and that she should document every significant decision that crossed her desk for the foreseeable future. She looked at me with the steady eyes of someone who has read a room correctly for years. "I'll keep careful records," she said. She always had. I made an appointment with our accountant for the following Monday, without telling my husband. I called my daughter, who lives in Portland, and told her what I had found. There was a long silence on the phone. Then she said, "Mom, I need to tell you something." She had seen my husband and our events coordinator at a restaurant in New Haven 4 months ago. She had told herself it was probably nothing. She had not wanted to worry me. She had been wrong not to tell me, and she was sorry. I told her she didn't need to apologize. I told her I loved her. I told her to come home the weekend after next. I said nothing to my husband. I made his coffee every morning. I asked about his day. I attended the staff meeting at our Harborview Stonebridge property on Friday and sat across the table from our events coordinator without changing my expression, watching her watch me for some sign that I knew what I knew. I gave her nothing. I was thinking about my grandmother, who grew up during the Depression, and used to say that the most powerful position in any negotiation is the one where the other person doesn't realize there's a negotiation happening. I had been underestimating my grandmother's advice my entire adult life. I stopped underestimating it that week. On Saturday evening, my husband said he had a late call with the contractor for our renovation in Mystic and would be a couple of hours. I told him that was fine. I was planning to do some reading. I watched his car pull out of the driveway. Then I went to his home office, which I had never gone through before in 35 years of marriage, because I had never before had reason to, and I photographed every document I could find that related to Stonebridge Holdings. There were more than I expected. Transfer agreements, correspondence with a law firm I didn't recognize, a draft document outlining a proposal to sell two of the Harborview properties to a development group, a sale my husband had apparently been in preliminary discussions about for 5 months, without a word to me, for properties that could not legally be sold without the licensing agreements I controlled. There was also a folder with her name on it. I did not open it. I had enough. I put everything back exactly as I found it, walked back to the living room, picked up my book, and was reading when my husband came home at 10:30, smelling of a restaurant I recognized. He kissed me on the top of the head and said he was tired and going to bed. I said goodnight. I waited until I heard him on the stairs. Then I texted my attorney. I have everything. Can you meet me Sunday morning? The Sunday meeting was 3 hours long. My attorney spread the documents I had photographed across her conference table, alongside the financial records her forensic accountant had been compiling and the trademark documentation I had pulled together. When it was laid out like that, all of it visible at once, it was a clear picture, not a complicated one. Not a picture that required any particular interpretation. My husband had been planning to exit. Not immediately and not messily, he was not an impulsive man. Carefully, over time, his intention, as best as my attorney and I could reconstruct it, was to complete the transfer of as many assets as possible to Stonebridge Holdings before initiating a divorce, so that what I received in the settlement would be the diminished version of what we had built, rather than the real thing. What he had not properly accounted for was that the real thing, the part that made all of it worth anything, had never been his to transfer. I filed for divorce on a Tuesday morning. My attorney filed the accompanying civil suit, citing breach of fiduciary duty and fraudulent transfer of jointly held business assets the same afternoon. The accounts connected to Stonebridge Holdings were frozen by court order before my husband came home from work that evening. He walked in at 6:15. I was sitting at the kitchen table, which is where I had been sitting when this started. In the same chair, with the same kind of tea, watching the same maple in the backyard. The leaves had mostly fallen now. He set his keys on the counter. He looked at me, and then at the manila envelope I had placed on the table between us, and something shifted in his face, not guilt, not yet, but the particular alertness of a careful man who has sensed a change in atmosphere. I've been served, he said. You have, I said. He sat down across from me. He was quiet for a moment in the way that people are quiet when they are recalibrating. Then he said, Emma, let's be rational about this. We don't need lawyers and courts. We can figure this out ourselves. I had known him for 38 years. I knew every version of his voice. This was the version he used when he wanted to return a negotiation to a table where he controlled the terms. I think we're past that, I said. His expression shifted to something more practiced. Emma, whatever you think you've found, you're reading it wrong. The Stonebridge entity was a tax structure, something the accountant recommended. There's nothing. I slid the folder toward him. Not the divorce papers, the Stonebridge documents, the correspondence with the development group, the draft sale proposal for two of our properties. He looked at the folder for a long time without touching it. Those conversations were preliminary, he said finally. Exploratory. Nothing was finalized. Without my knowledge or consent, I said. For properties you cannot legally sell without licenses that are registered in my name. He leaned back. He was 61 years old and still a handsome man. And for a moment I felt the particular grief of looking at someone you have loved for most of your adult life and understanding that you never fully knew them. The grief was real. I did not let it move me. He tried several more approaches over the next 20 minutes. The marriage was complicated. We had both made mistakes. The business pressures had been enormous. He had made some poor decisions, but his intentions I let him finish each one. I had nothing in particular to say to any of them. When he was done, I stood up. I'm going to my daughter's for the next few weeks, I said. My attorney will be in contact with yours. I want you to understand something clearly before I go. He looked up at me. Harborview is mine, I said. It was mine before you joined me, and it's mine now. You are welcome to pursue whatever legal argument you'd like to make about the properties, but without the trademark, without the certifications, without the brand that I built and trademarked and spent 30 years making worth something, what you have is a collection of buildings. I have Harborview, and I intend to keep it. I picked up my bag from the hallway. I had packed it 3 days earlier. He was still sitting at the kitchen table when I walked out. My daughter's house in Portland was warm and full of good noise. Her husband, her 2 children who were 12 and 9 and deeply uninterested in adult problems, a dog who treated everyone as a long-lost friend. I sat at her kitchen table the first evening and let myself cry for exactly 1 hour, which felt appropriate to 35 years. Then I dried my face, helped my grandson with his math homework, and got on with things. The legal proceedings were not simple. My husband had a good attorney who made vigorous arguments about the legitimacy of the Stonebridge structure and the validity of the transfer agreements. There were depositions and counterfilings and a period of several weeks when I received documents on a nearly daily basis. I read every one. I was no longer signing things without reading them. Our events coordinator resigned 2 weeks after I filed for divorce. I did not pursue any legal action against her. She was not the primary architect of what had happened, and I had no interest in her beyond the damage she had participated in. She sent me a brief email on her last day. It said only, "I'm sorry. You deserved better from both of us." I read it once and did not respond. What I did not expect was the call I received from our head of operations, a woman who had been with me for 11 years. She called me at my daughter's house on a Thursday evening and said she needed to tell me something she had been sitting on for 6 months. A meeting she had witnessed, my husband, our events coordinator, and a man she didn't recognize in the conference room at our Mystic property on a Sunday morning when they had not realized she was in the building. She had caught enough of the conversation to understand that they were discussing the development group. She had told herself she might have misunderstood. She had been wrong not to come to me sooner. I told her the same thing I had told my daughter. No apology necessary. Then I told her that when this resolved, I was going to need someone I trusted completely to step into an expanded role. She said she would be ready. The court proceedings took 4 months. The outcome was not simple, but it was fair in the way that outcomes based on documented evidence tend to be fair. The fraudulent transfer claims held up. The development sale discussions, having been conducted without my knowledge or legal consent, were voided. Stonebridge Holdings was dissolved. 3 properties whose equity had been drawn down by loans I had never authorized were subject to a separate settlement in which my husband bore the personal financial liability for loans taken without my signature or approval. He did not go to prison. There had been enough ambiguity in the documentation, enough places where his attorney could argue that the restructuring had been advised as legitimate tax strategy, that the criminal threshold wasn't clearly met. I was not entirely satisfied with this outcome. I was not destroyed by it either. The civil remedy had done what I needed it to do, put the business back on solid ground, and made clear to everyone involved, including the banks and the development group and our industry contacts, exactly what had happened and who had been responsible. My husband and I were legally divorced on a March morning that came in cold and bright. I was sitting in my attorney's office when the paperwork was finalized. She handed me the documents across the desk with a look of genuine satisfaction, and I looked at my own name, my maiden name, which I had never legally changed even when everyone assumed I had, and felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't realized had been unsettled for years. There is a particular kind of freedom that comes not from getting what you wanted, but from finally being done pretending that you have it when you don't. I had been pretending for longer than I wanted to admit, pretending the partnership was equal, pretending the dynamic was healthy, pretending that the gradual diminishment of my role in my own company was something I had chosen rather than something that had been slowly arranged around me. The pretending had taken more energy than I had ever properly accounted for. Getting to stop was a kind of rest I hadn't known I needed. That spring, I sat down with a legal pad and thought carefully about what Harborview should be going forward, not what it had been. Not a restoration of the past, which was gone, but something that moved honestly from where things actually were. I started with the name. Harborview was mine, and I kept it, but I gave it a new addition. I called the collection Harborview by Whitmore, putting my grandmother's name back into it. The property where it had all begun, her crooked little house with the view that made people stop their cars, had always been called Whitmore House. It felt right to let the whole thing carry that history forward, to acknowledge where it had actually come from before I had started telling a more complicated story about it. I brought in a managing director, my head of operations, who stepped into the role she had always been qualified for. I restructured the leadership so that decisions above a certain threshold required 2 signatures. I updated every licensing agreement, every certification, every contract, and I read all of them before I signed. I hired a new events coordinator, a young woman from Vermont with strong references and the kind of clear eyes that suggested she said what she meant. I told her directly, in her first week, that this was a company built on a particular set of values, and that if she ever saw those values being compromised from any direction, including from me, I expected her to say so. She looked slightly surprised. Then she said, "I'll hold you to that." "Good," I said. "That's the right answer." The autumn season that year was the strongest we had seen in a decade. I don't take credit for this, the business had been strong before, and would likely have been strong regardless. But there was something in the culture of the company that had shifted. People noticed. Our guest satisfaction scores went up. Our staff turnover went down. 2 long-term employees who had quietly begun interviewing elsewhere decided to stay. I don't know exactly what they noticed or why they decided to stay, but I have a theory. People can feel. The way they feel whether an organization is being led by someone who is present or someone who is performing the appearance of presence. I had been performing for a long time. I was done with that. My daughter came to stay for a week in October, the same month this had all begun a year before. We sat on the porch of the Whitmore House property on a Sunday morning, watching the harbor, and she asked me how I was doing. Really doing. I thought about the question honestly before I answered. The way I have been trying to answer questions honestly since this began. "I'm better than I've been in years," I said. Not because of what happened, in spite of it, and maybe because of what came after. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I always knew you built this. I just wasn't sure you knew it." I watched a sailboat come in around the point, moving carefully through the calm water. My grandmother had stood on this same shoreline 60 years before me and seen something worth building, and she had left it to me, and I had spent 30 years sometimes remembering that, and sometimes forgetting it. I was not going to forget it again. I thought about the email that had started all of this. A celebration dinner for 2, champagne on the terrace, a new beginning for someone else arranged in a space that was mine. I thought about how I had felt in the first moment of reading it. Not devastated, though devastation came later, but something colder and clearer. The feeling of a woman who has been half asleep for years suddenly and completely awake. She had sent me a love letter to their beginning. I had sent back the documentation that made their beginning built on sand. But that was not the real story. The real story was not about what I sent back or what I took away. It was about what I did next. What I had always been capable of doing and had spent too long allowing someone else's narrative to keep me from. If you are somewhere in this country listening to this right now and something in it is familiar, if you recognize that particular slow erosion, that gradual shifting of terms, that creeping sense of becoming smaller in the very space you built, I want to say something to you directly. Not as advice. I am not in the business of telling other people what to do with their lives. Just this. What you built is still there. It is waiting for you to remember that it's yours. Before you close out, tell me where you're listening from today. I love hearing from every corner of this country, and if this story found its way to you, subscribe and stay close, because tomorrow I have something waiting that I think you are going to need to hear.